There's a place I dream about sometimes, a place where the world simply ends. No grand abyss, no raging storm at the brink, just a thin line of mist where land dissolves into nothing and sky folds itself into silence. I imagine walking there, boots heavy with dust, the grit hissing beneath every step, the air thinning with every shallow breath, metallic and sharp, like the taste of old coins on my tongue. The light would shift strangely around me, bending in ways that made the horizon quiver and the sky smear into liquid silver. My fingers would brush over cracked stones, each one warm and trembling as if the ground itself were alive, humming a low, sorrowful note I could feel deep in my bones. Somewhere overhead, a birdless sky would press downward, so close it might tear if I reached out far enough. My heartbeat would slow against the thick silence, a pulsing drum in a world that seemed to have forgotten sound. Every instinct would scream to turn back, but wonder, or maybe defiance, would keep me moving forward. A horizon that never curves, a sky stretched flat like taut cloth, and beyond it, an unknown more final than death. What if the earth was not a sphere sailing joyfully through darkness, but a vast cracked mirror lying still beneath a shallow dome of fractured stars? What if all our notions of distance, of depth, of direction were careful lies told to comfort us? A story repeated across centuries so that we would not peer too closely at the fragile skin of reality? I close my eyes and I can almost feel it. The cold breath of that edge, carrying the sterile scent of ozone and scorched stone. I imagine kneeling there, pressing my palm to the trembling earth, feeling it quiver under the weight of questions too heavy for any single mind to bear. How far could I reach before my own thoughts dissolved into the mist? How long could I look before my own reflection, my understanding of what is and is not, fractured like brittle glass under a rising tide? Somewhere in the back of my mind, I hear a distant echo. Not words, but a feeling. A gravity pulling at the heart, that maybe we were never meant to find the edge. That the horizon was never hiding anything at all, except ourselves. If the earth were flat, gravity would not be the silent, faithful companion we take for granted. It would betray us, slowly, cruelly, bending the very rules we thought immutable. Standing at the center of the disk, life would seem deceptively familiar. The ground firm beneath your shoes, the familiar weight of your body pressing into the earth. The grass would sway softly in a lazy breeze. The trees would stretch upward, straight and true, the way they always have. But every step outward from that center would shift reality, almost imperceptibly at first. The wind would seem to tug at you oddly, a faint but growing resistance. Walking would feel like pushing through syrup, every muscle subtly fighting against an invisible incline you couldn't yet name. Pebbles would begin to slide backward across the dirt. The soil would grow looser, the scent of dust rising thicker into the air, clogging your nose with its dry mineral taste. Trees would bow toward the hidden center, their trunks arching like dancers caught mid-fall, their leaves trembling with the strain. The sun itself would appear to skew in the sky, its light falling at odd, uneasy angles, warping shadows into crooked slashes across the ground. Your legs would burn with effort as the unseen slope steepened, your breath rasping louder in the thinning, oxygen-starved air. And closer to the edge, walking would become climbing. The soil would crumble beneath your boots, forcing you to grasp at roots, at stones slick with fine grit, your fingers bleeding against their razor textures. Gravity would not be a single downward pull anymore, but a twisting force dragging you sideways, backward, inward. The world would seem to tilt crazily around you, the horizon stretching and buckling like molten glass. Somewhere far behind, you might hear the low moan of rivers sliding backward, of buildings groaning under the strain of their own impossible angles. No towering wall of ice would be needed to trap humanity within its cage. Gravity itself would weave the prison, a web of force so absolute that no one would ever reach the edge. Every attempt to flee would only bring you back to the center, drawn by a hunger older than reason, stronger than will. And in the end, you would realize something colder than fear. That on a flat earth, you are not standing still, but forever falling back toward the point where it all began. And where it will end. Without a molten core spinning deep beneath our feet, there would be no magnetic field to cradle the earth in invisible arms, no shimmering shield to fend off the rage of the sun. At first, we might not notice. The winds would still whisper through the valleys. The clouds would still pile into lazy mountains of white. But slowly, almost tenderly, the sky would begin to thin. A clarity would seep into the blue, unsettling, too sharp, as if the heavens themselves were being scraped clean. You would feel it on your skin first, a tingling sensation, like static clinging to your arms, the faint smell of something burned lingering in your nostrils. As the months wore on, the colors of the world would start to fade. The greens would dull to a tired olive. The oceans would lose their rich sapphire and sink into a flat, bruised gray. Standing by the shore, you would watch the tides tremble, confused, pulling inward toward a deepening hollow at the center of the world. The water would taste metallic, bitter against your tongue, thickened with unseen poisons seeping from a sky no longer kind. The auroras we once marveled at would mutate, snarling into jagged curtains of radiation, invisible to the eye but lethal to the bone. You would walk beneath a sun that loved nothing, and a night that offered no comfort. The silence around you thick with the slow disintegration of everything alive. Forests would collapse inward, their trunks splintering with hollow cracks. The smell of decay would drift across empty fields, heavy as wet wool. The oceans would shrink back toward the heart of the disk, boiling off under an indifferent glare, leaving behind plains of salt that shimmered under a deathly heat. In this new earth, the air would grow heavy with the stink of dying water and scorched stone. Breathing would become an act of defiance, lungs clawing at a thinning atmosphere that no longer wished to stay. And above it all, the stars would shine harder, colder, no longer softened by the kindness of an atmosphere, but stabbing straight into your gaze. Cruel and perfect. You could hear it if you stood still enough. The slow unraveling of the world's seams, a delicate tearing sound like silk ripped by unseen hands, a planet exhaling for the last time. Not with a scream, but with a long, shuddering sigh that scattered itself across the vacuum, unnoticed, unremembered. On a flat Earth, the rhythm of time would fracture into something alien. No more gentle turning of morning into evening, no soft hush of twilight spilling across the land. Instead, a lonely sun would pace endlessly above us, a tired sentinel dragging its light across the broken landscape. I imagine standing beneath that sky, the air sharp and motionless, the light too direct, too sterile. In one half of the world, the heat would press down like a weight, the soil splitting open in long, thirsty cracks that breathed the acrid scent of scorched roots. In the other half, darkness would sprawl out in endless sheets, the cold so deep it would feel oily against your skin, a living thing creeping into your bones. There would be no balance anymore. In the lands trapped in perpetual day, the wind would die, strangled by the unchanging heat. Crops would wither under a merciless glare. The rivers would shrink to muddy scars crawling with flies. The buzzing would fill the air, a constant, maddening drone that sank into the hollows of your skull. In the frozen lands, the silence would be worse, a smothering void broken only by the creak of ice splitting under its own weight. A sound like distant thunder, trapped beneath the ground. Your breath would hang in the air like smoke, freezing into fragile crystals that clung to your eyelashes, your lips. The smell of iron and frost would fill your nose, sharp and clean and merciless. I picture entire cities deserted, their empty windows staring blankly into endless noon or unbroken night. Time would lose meaning without sunsets to mark its passing. The very idea of a day, a year, would dissolve into confusion and drift. People would follow the moving boundary where light and darkness briefly kissed, caravans of the desperate, chasing the fragile twilight, like moths chasing the last flicker of a dying flame. The world would tilt toward madness, as minds fractured under the strain of a sun that would not sleep, and a night that would not wake. Tides would no longer move with any grace, caught instead in great churning spirals, oceans spinning around a distant, indifferent center. Rain would fall erratically, twisting sideways on winds that no longer obeyed the old patterns. I imagine stepping into a downpour under such a sky, feeling the droplets strike from impossible angles, cold and sharp as needles, soaking through cloth, through skin, into the marrow. It would feel less like rain, and more like the sky itself, bleeding apart. And in that broken world, standing at the blurred line where endless day fought endless night, I would wonder if somewhere, beneath all this collapse, the memory of true sunrise still slept, waiting for a world brave enough to remember how to turn once more. In the ruins of a flattened world, it would not be the stones or the seas that told our story. It would be the remnants of our own questions, scattered like bones across the abandoned libraries, the silent observatories, the collapsed museums. I imagine wandering through such a place, a library with no roof, its shelves slumped sideways like exhausted sentinels. Pages torn free by feral winds would flutter across the broken tiles, their ink bleeding into ghostly stains under a pale, pitiless sun. The air would taste of mold and rust, heavy with the scent of dying knowledge. Every step would crunch across shattered glass, across instruments that once pointed bravely at the stars, now rusting into obscurity. Our sciences would fragment first. Without the magnetic field, without the tides, without the steady spin of a planet in balance, the laws we trusted would collapse like rotted beams under too much weight. Gravity itself would become local, distorted, a cruel trickster pulling sideways and inward, defying every equation we ever scribbled on blackboards, now cracked and empty. Maps would become artifacts of another reality, crumpled parchments showing oceans that no longer exist, continents pulled into grotesque spirals by forces we could no longer comprehend. The smell of old ink would cling to the paper, sharp and sour, the scent of a forgotten optimism. I imagine children growing up beneath this broken sky, never knowing the clean geometry of seasons, the subtle arc of constellations wheeling overhead. To them, science would be myth, half-remembered tales of a world that once made sense, where rivers obeyed gravity and the stars told time. They would build their own explanations from the ruins, stitching together desperate theories about the slanted rains, the sideways pull of stones, the stubborn refusal of the horizon to curve. Some would whisper about ancient gods still angry, others would chart imaginary suns in the dome overhead, tracing their cold fingers across cracked atlases. The earth to them would be a place of wandering forces and hungry edges, where the sky presses downward like a leaden hand, and the only certainty is change. I think of a child, barefoot, hair tangled with ash, holding a shard of broken lens up to the sun, watching how the light splits and scatters, trying to understand why the heavens bleed colors no one can name. Around them, the ruins would hum softly with the echo of a lost ambition, a vibration felt more in the heart than the ear. Not anger, not even sadness, just a long, low memory of a species that once believed it could measure the infinite, and forgot that it too was fragile. If the earth were flat, perhaps the greatest transformation would not lie in the way rivers flow, or how forests bend. It would seep deeper, into the architecture of our minds, into the very marrow of what we dare to believe. I imagine walking the final distance toward the edge, my boots scraping across a cracked and shimmering plain. The ground would tremble subtly beneath me, a deep, slow vibration almost beyond hearing, like the breath of something vast stirring in its sleep. The air would grow thin, brittle, carrying the faint scent of scorched minerals and distant lightning. Overhead, the sky would sag inward, the blue deepening into something almost black at the horizon, as if space itself were pressing closer, curious. At the brink, there would be no cliff, no yawning emptiness, only a shimmering veil, a translucent film stretched so thin it might rupture at the brush of a hand. I imagine reaching out, fingertips hovering inches from it, feeling the charged air prickling against my skin, humming against my nails. The smell would sharpen like rain striking hot stone. Through the veil, vague shapes would seem to drift, echoes of landscapes we never knew, cities flickering into existence and vanishing before they could be named. Not visions of another place, but reflections of our own lost possibilities, twisted into forms both beautiful and terrible. And maybe then it would become clear that belief has its own gravity, that what we call reality is stitched together from expectations and dreams, held together by the frailest of threads, that somewhere, in all our calculations and theories, we forgot that the universe is not obligated to make sense to us. It owes us no answers, only wonder, only mystery, only the whisper of endless questions slipping through our fingers like mist. I would step back from the trembling veil, the electric taste of it lingering on my tongue. The world around me would seem suddenly hollow, like a theater set abandoned after the actors had fled. The stones underfoot, the mountains in the distance, even the stars above. All just layers of meaning we had draped over a canvas too vast to see. And I would understand, in the deep hush of that moment, that perhaps the earth was never truly flat or round. Perhaps it was always simply a mirror, reflecting our hopes, our fears, our hunger for certainty in a cosmos that refuses to be contained. As I turned away from the edge, the mist curling around my ankles like smoke, a final thought would catch in my throat, raw and urgent, refusing to be silenced. What if we have never really seen the world at all? What if the world has only ever been seeing us?